Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Welcome to another episode of Late Nights with Big Daddy Liberty. That's right, Late Nights with your favorite fat boy, Big Daddy Liberty. Molo, and welcome to it. I hope you guys have had a fantastic weekend. Shavua Tov to those of you who are Jews and are observant. It's the start of a new week. I hope you guys are going to have a fantastic week. Indeed, all of us are going to have a fantastic week. Guys, welcome to it. As I said, I must warn everybody at the early onset, there may be some glitches. Because I'm trialing some new stuff here. But with that being said, I do hope things will be very smooth. Just give me a moment, everybody. Let me just make sure that we give it a second or so for everybody to be able to join us on this episode of Late Nights with BDL. Whilst I'm at it, how about you guys blow up the comment section? I want to know how you guys are doing. Are you well, guys? What's been going on? I hope you've been having a rather interesting last week. And an interesting weekend. So hopefully I'll sort of see shortly as to what you guys have been up to. As I quickly just check my feed, make sure everything's pashash, as we say. Maybe as I do that, let me also take this opportunity to thank every single one of you who are Patreon subscribers who are joining on to the Liberty Bus, who maybe watched the last Big Daddy Liberty show I did, where I explained exactly what it is that you're supporting, what it is I'll be doing over the next 6 months and essentially for the rest of my life as I work to build that culture of a liberty-leaning, a prosperous, free, and property-owning society, that someone has to do the groundwork. That if we want these ideas to succeed in a society, then someone, I must repeat, has to do the groundwork. And what is that groundwork? Just to quickly revisit, it's the idea that at a point of crisis, at a society at a point of crisis, it is he who injects the greatest volume of ideas into that society who will succeed. Let me repeat that because it's very tough for a lot of people to understand the battle of ideas at times because we get so discouraged. But it is a society at the point of a crisis, as South Africa is, it is he who injects the greatest volume of ideas into that society who will succeed. And it's quite simple then in that regard as to what my personal mission is for this country. When you love a country like South Africa, when you have a love for faith, flag, freedom, and family, then of course you'll want to be involved in the battle of ideas. Of course you will want to be a crusader for popular capitalism, for free markets, for a freedom-loving society, for families to be at the root of all decision-making in society, for individuals to be more powerful, if you will, than politicians, definitely, and more powerful than government. These are the ideas that I'll be fighting for, that I'll be hitting the streets of the country, basically advocating for across the country. So a lot of work is laying ahead of me, but it is people like you who are donating that $1 a month via Patreon who are supporting the work and what I will be doing. And of course, every single minute of that will be brought to you here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Guys, welcome to it if you've just joined us. I just want to quickly shout out all the new Patreons subscribers that have joined us, that have donated, to the Liberty Bus. I'm going to be quite quick in doing this, but again, my being quick shouldn't be a sign of me being flippant. I am incredibly indebted to all of you. Let me just quickly shout out Jeff Zitzman. Homie, shout out to you for the $25 support. Enes Fenter, I see you. Neil Spisadenote, Linda Jane Simone, welcome to the Liberty Bus. Chantel Cowley de Brain, welcome. Samantha Marriott, welcome to the Liberty Bus. Gary Black, Wale or Wali, Whaley. Dean Biefus, thank you very much for the support. Marnus Nischen, I hope I pronounced that correctly, but thank you so much for the support. Samantha Marriott, hello. Gary Black, and of course, I think I've mentioned everybody. Guys, thank you so much for being the new Patreon subscribers and getting on the Liberty Bus as we roll on the mission of creating a free, prosperous, and property-owning society. Okay, guys, I've given it enough time. If you've just joined us, welcome, welcome. Let me just make sure everything is okay before I transition to my guests. Yes, you heard it. I have guests on the show. I finally worked out the kinks to my software, and I now can actually have guests. Yay! On the live stream. Let's see here. Okay, a slight glitch I'm seeing. Let me just quickly fix it. I don't think the chat window is working. Okay, it is. Okay, perfect. Hey, guys, I see all of you. Welcome to the show. All right, let me get straight into it then, now that we done got that out the way. And tonight's topic is a really interesting one. It's a very serious one. And it's one which warrants, I think, a conversation because it has implications not only for Americans, where a lot of this is happening at the moment, but also for us here in South Africa. And that's the issue of police brutality. We're going to have that conversation in a very broad sense tonight. Insofar as looking at, the role of the state, at the core root of an issue like police brutality is the relationship we have as citizens to government, because ultimately police, and I've always said this on the show, every law, every legislation that you have thrown at you by politicians is, of course, backed up by what I've always argued to be state violence. A government can only enforce its regime of legislation and laws if there is the threat, of course, of either imprisoning you, which is a form of violence in and of itself, because it's a denial of your right to freedom, obviously in the context of you having gone through the rule of law, or rather the court system, to get to the point of imprisoning you. But essentially, point remains, there's the threat of being able to restrict your freedom. And of course, the more overt one, as it relates to police brutality, is the idea that the state can use violence against you and actually end your life at times or deprive you of property. The very things that are God-given rights to every single individual, the rights to life, liberty and property. So we're going to have that conversation framed in that direction. And as I said, it's going to be a broad conversation because we're going to look at this from multiple angles, especially as a sociological discussion tonight around, for example, is it really a race issue, or is it the identity politics that drives a lot of the angst and the looting and the riotous violence that we're seeing in the US? When it comes to South Africa, is it a race issue? So we're going to have that conversation today as we go along, and I'll get to my guest just now. But as I say that, let me just quickly preface it by saying this. For the past week, the United States has seen some of the worst public violence and riotous looting in history, or sort of memorable history for those of us, the younger generation. The violence and the destruction has been so shocking that to those of us who are South Africans looking in that direction, observing Americans, it would have actually looked like any scene out of the streets of here in South Africa, where we have these sort of violent protests and looting on occasion. I mean, just think back to the xenophobic violence that we saw, where a lot of it devolved into just sheer looting and criminality. That is in America right now, looking at those shocking scenes can actually momentarily leave you not being able to work out what exactly is going on in that part of the world. When one considers, for instance, the jumbled mix of role players and vested interest groups that are involved, from Black Lives Matter to Antifa, the various roles that mostly Democrat party mayors and governors have played in this debacle, right up to the President of the United States, Donald Trump. It's been easy to lose track of what exactly is it that any of all this violence and any of all this social unrest seeks to achieve. We've actually lost track of that, to be honest. And I asked myself the question, what does the mob of these rioters and looters actually want? Of course, they can't tell you any of that because they're too busy making off with their stolen loot at the moment, destroying storefronts and public buildings and assaulting and even killing law-abiding citizens. That's what we've seen in America at the moment. In Minneapolis, the city where all of this began, as of Friday night, at least 530 businesses across the Twin Cities have essentially been vandalized, looted, and had their doors and windows smashed. Some of these businesses have been reduced to complete rubble, with at least 67 of them having been destroyed completely by various fires that were set by the rioters. The picture, of course, is pretty much the same across cities in America that saw similar acts of riotous looting sprees, from New York to Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. to Dallas, billions of dollars in damage, with many of these businesses already on the brink after having endured months of being shut down during the government-mandated lockdown in that part of the world. Yes, they also had a lockdown like we did. So again, these were small mom and pop shop businesses that were already teetering at the end, or at the edge rather, because of the lockdown. And now to have this violence and the destruction of property, the erosion essentially of their hard work and their savings by the rioters, paints a very grim picture for where the United States of America is at the moment. And of course, at the heart of this, before I introduce my guests, is, as I mentioned, in Minneapolis, what sparked this was the tragic circumstances under which George Floyd, a black American — I don't like using the word African American, I don't actually view black Americans as African, and I don't think a lot of them self-identify as African, but in any event, the tragic circumstances of George Floyd, which supposedly started all of this violence, or I should say, he didn't die at the hands of the police, he died at the knee. If I'm to be brutally honest, of a police officer who basically kept his knee on this man's neck for over 8 minutes until he succumbed. But the question is, all these vested interest groups that I've mentioned, are they actually interested in addressing the issue of police brutality, or is there a larger politics at play here, which we need to be mindful of? So we're going to have that conversation. And to join me in this conversation, let me welcome my two guests as I quickly just transition to them now over here. I'm joined, of course, by Mr. Dumo Denga, who is the host of the Manpatria podcast. Shout out to you, Dumo. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sihle. Much appreciated.
Good to have you, man. And of course, I'm joined by a voice who you've heard on the show before. In fact, both of these individuals have been on the show, Dumo being a regular contributor on my other show called Blacks Only, but we'll cross that bridge when we eventually get to it. But my other guest, of course, is Mr. Hugo Kruger, who we've actually had a few shows with. Hugo, homie, how are you doing?
Good, thanks yourself. Thanks for having me. I'm coming here all the way from France.
Damn straight home. You know how it is. I always pick up my fellow South Africans wherever y'all are in the world. Guys, welcome to the show. I think I want us to hop into it because it's been such a fascinating, for those of us who, studied psychology and sociology, it's been a fascinating thing to observe. The sheer breakdown, firstly, of the rule of law in America and the various narratives, most importantly, the various narratives that are driving this breakdown. So I don't know where I want to begin here because there's so much to discuss, but let's maybe look at what sparked the incident, and maybe just get to a sense where let's see where we agree and then where we disagree. Guys, America, I think rightly, is seeing, initially at least, saw protests erupt at the scenes of George Floyd's killing by a police officer. And a lot of people, especially those, because remember the protests began in that actual community by the locals before it got taken over by other vested interest groups. But in any event, I think that community was quite right in expressing their anger and saying this is unacceptable. No person should ever face the real prospect of dying simply because of what should be a mundane or routine, rather, police stop or a routine arrest if you are being arrested. Your thoughts on this? Hugo, let me begin with you.
Yeah, so I want to backtrack a bit. You talked about the breakdown of the rule of law. We need to define what is the rule of law.
Yeah.
Do they mean the rule of law? Do they mean the rule of law enforcement? So the rule of law, it's actually very simple. It comes from the theory of John Locke, I believe it was, which based the divisions of power, create the concept of divisions of power. The legislator legislates, the executive executes, okay, and what is the other one? I think the judiciary adjudicates.
That's right. Okay?
So that's the rule of law. The rule of law is dividing powers. When the police kill somebody, when people riot, that's not the rule of law breaking down. That's the rule of law enforcement. That's people breaking the rules. So before we can start saying the rule of law broke down, my question is we saw a man being killed by a police officer, from what I can tell on the photo. And I will come back later by what I can tell, because it's very important in these things. But the question is, the guy who was killed, was he breaking a law? Was the rule of law being enforced at the time? These are the necessary discussions we need to have. Because if a government, which was the case in America, the case in France, the case in South Africa, can suck out rules out of their thumb, that means they have not gone through the parliamentary procedure. They have not followed the rule of law themselves. So when we say the rule of law breaks down, it is the role of government not understanding their unique roles that broke down. It has nothing to do with the rioters. So in this case, I would say, yes, the rule of law did break down, because the American cops were being told to enforce rules which did not follow the legal proceedings. Did the Congress vote on the rules which George Floyd broke? What was the police being told? Were they enforcing a rule? Which law did he break before he even got killed? And that discussion is, in my view, much more important than the fact that the policeman sadly murdered somebody.
I mean, I think quite rightly, in terms of just breaking down, the meaning of words and what exactly we mean when we say certain things. Dumo, let me throw it to you. I mean, apart from Hugo's comments, the scenes that we saw play out, whether one prosecutes the issue of what he did or didn't do, or the rule of law or not in this instance, should an encounter with a police officer, within America or here, lead to a death like that when seemingly the issue is such a non-serious one at times? And again, before you even say anything, because I know it's going to happen in the comments, I am fully aware that George Floyd has, and I've seen it all over social media, his checkered past has come up for people's criticisms, and I think rightly so. But insofar as this incident, it doesn't change the fact that he has died at the hands of a police officer, regardless of who he was as a person, that there's something to be said about that. Dumo.
Yeah, it's actually, you mentioned a very good point there. I think that with the situation of George Floyd, I think that even though he may have a dodgy, it doesn't necessarily mean that the actions of the police officer are justified. So, I mean, when this incident actually first hit social media, the first response I made was that, well, look, I mean, this is a case of bad policing. Did he have to put his knee on the guy's neck? And I think that is the main question here. So just to answer that, I mean, I don't think he had to die. In my opinion, I think he could have used far better methods. And also, there was another video as well where it actually showed there were actually about two other officers on top of Floyd, right? Or who have already secured him. So there was no need to put the knee on the neck. So yeah, he didn't have to die, in my opinion.
Absolutely, and I think there's, and I want to put it to both of you guys, because I think Hugo raises an important point around the nature of the laws themselves, and given the numerous amounts of them, the likelihood, therefore, that certain segments of a society, and maybe let me pose this as a question. Guys, when you have a government that is ballooning in size, and with it ballooning, the number of laws is growing with it, and that number of laws inevitably meaning that many segments of a society will inevitably come into greater contact with the police, often and in an antagonistic way. Is there something to be said about that? When we look at the issue of police brutality, is it wise, Hugo, for us to also have the conversation about the nature of the very government itself that is legislating and growing in size and obviously sicking those police onto people? Because even as I ask you that question, here in South Africa, we had an apt example of that, where when the state gave itself, times 10 or times 100-fold more power through the form of a lockdown, and it controlled everything, and then sicked police and sicked soldiers onto people. We also saw some really horrific cases of police brutality down here, including the case of Collins Causer, for instance. So your thoughts on that, the size of government as being maybe a cause?
It's paramount. I mean, it's not just South Africa and America. India had cases where the police were beating people with sticks. In Namibia, the police thugs got out and they were beating people, random people walking in the street, not even knowing the laws were passed when this lockdown started. In France, in Marseille, you had police brutally beating people. So I'm surprised, actually, that so few people got killed. The problem comes in that when you have too many laws, the enforcement of the law becomes arbitrary. And because it is arbitrary, you're seeing these consequences where some people are being killed, some people are being saved, because the law enforcement themselves don't know what law to enforce. The people don't know what law they are breaking, what they're not following. So, this to me is the cause of a lot of this strife. I mean, you speak about over-policing. There's a very important documentary I would like people to watch from Journeyman Pictures about the Baltimore protests which happened in America a few years ago. What made the black community in America boil over was not the fact that they were being killed by the police, sad as it was. There was a precedent to that, which was they were over-policed and they got traffic fines for every little silly thing that they broke, which was not the rule to be broken. And because of that, you had a community who felt victimized, who feels that the blood is going to boil over. So I'm not surprised that there is constantly these type of riots in America. You should expect it if you over-police a community for ridiculous things. This is where the concept of the consent of the governed is so important. Nobody disagrees with the fact that if somebody who is a killer should be policed. Nobody disagrees with the fact, any reasonable person, that if somebody loots a store, he should be arrested. But there are some laws on the books which are being enforced by the police in a very arbitrary matter onto these communities, poor as they are, they cannot pay it. And if you look at the origin of this, especially in America, and I won't be surprised if it's the case in South Africa, that a lot of these fines are being used to finance municipal governments in the United States. So the municipal governments have an incentive to arbitrarily enforce rules, sort of squeeze the black community there for their fines, and this creates the boiling pot. And then when something comes where a policeman shots or kills people, like it was in Baltimore, like it was with Michael Brown, for whatever reason, legitimate or illegitimate, the community boils over. And sadly, in South Africa, we're having the same thing as well. I mean, we all remember the apartheid thing. My father was in the apartheid police. A lot of things that went wrong back there was the fact that the apartheid police, okay, first of all, they were semi-paramilitary. They called in the army to do the police's work. And we should get to that distinction later on as well, where you had no more distinction what is a soldier and what is a policeman. And then they try and enforce the rules. Yeah. And of course, you're going to have chaos.
Yeah. No, and I think you're quite right. In fact, I was going to segue into that very place as I bring the conversation back here to South Africa, because we saw that failure to make that distinction between the army and a police force. Dumo, and I want to throw this to you because we've had this conversation to a large extent around the lockdown. And we saw exactly what Hugo is describing here, where politicians who appropriated for themselves the power to arbitrarily set regulations, almost unchecked, not almost, actually unchecked, because there was no parliament initially. Parliament had, for whatever reason, not that parliament is particularly useful generally, but in this instance, you would have hoped that they play some role. Abdicated this role for the first 2 weeks, I think, because they were in a recess. So you literally had an exec in this country who then declare a disaster, which appropriates for themselves all sorts of powers to make sweeping regulations. And with those regulations, which came from Buffalo Bill, for those who aren't initiated, Buffalo Bill is my nickname from Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, because she literally stood over a hole with Cyril deep down in the hole, and she said, he puts the mask on his face or else he gets the hose again. Yes, that joke came back. Anyway, jokes aside, but you literally had politicians in this country who appropriated for themselves great powers under the name of this national state of disaster. And then to enforce these new regulations, arbitrary many as they were, they sicked soldiers and police officers onto South Africans to enforce these new regulations. So Dumo, I must bring the question to you. When we look at the issue of police brutality, when we look at the issue of the brutality generally of the state, and I don't know how to phrase this question because I'm going to get to the politics behind it, and especially the identity politics in the next set of questions. But let me phrase it to you now this way. In South Africa, over this lockdown period, you literally saw 250,000 people nearly being arrested over just a few months. You saw 11, 12, 13, in fact, people brutally murdered or died under suspicious circumstances involving the police and the soldiers. Should a functional liberal democratic society ever see soldiers being sicked on their own citizens? And what is the role of soldiers? Should they be on the streets policing things like this?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that soldiers are not meant to be doing the police's job. Soldiers are I mean, they train to kill. I mean, these are highly skilled professionals in actually protecting the country. So I find it quite odd that the government actually goes out and actually brings soldiers to police individuals. And also, I mean, the police in this country is also, they leave a lot to be desired. I mean, I think the police commissioner even said like a year ago or a few months ago, stated that the police mandate is too large for them and they don't have enough funds to actually fulfill that mandate. So yeah, and it's not a good thing. And talking about the government size and everything like that, I mean, the thing about it, when the government actually goes around and implements laws like this without having to be checked, they do crazy stuff. And the lockdown is an example of this. And the thing about expropriation without compensation, one of the regulations that the ANC wanted to put in place is that the executive decides if the land should be expropriated or not. And now, given what the executive can do with this lockdown and how they've acted, we should be very concerned, given the fact that they want more power to themselves without having to be checked.
Hugo, Dumo hits the nail on the head. It does seem as though the ANC, using the guise of COVID, was basically testing the limits of what it can and can't do in terms of exercising violence against citizens. And I'm going to throw the same question to you just now, but I want to frame it in this way. There is a danger that, therefore, of an ANC that now realizes that, generally speaking, decent segments, a large minority, let me put it that way, of South Africans will yield to the threat and the specter of soldiers on the street. A large minority of South Africans will yield to arbitrary regulations being thrown in their faces. A large minority, if you will, of South Africans are willing to even clap on the use of violence, the use of soldiers, the use of arbitrary diktats from politicians to run a society. Do you think an ANC looking at that is now suddenly then emboldened to say, okay, if they accepted us doing this under the period of lockdown, then of course they'll accept things like expropriation or compensation. Of course they'll accept things like prescribed assets, which is the confiscating of people's pension funds to fund state-owned enterprises. Of course they'll accept things like NHI, the National Health Insurance, which is essentially the nationalization of healthcare. When you then look at this issue, do you not think that there is something greater at play here, whether here in South Africa or even in other societies around the world that use these methods during this so-called COVID pandemic?
It's a very, very important question. I mean, the first thing here that we've learned from this whole experience has been that there are some people in the world who like authority being thrown at them. They like following the rules. They don't understand the distinction between the rule of law, and I think they don't want to understand it. They're scared to death. I was very worried when this whole thing started. I'm still worried about mass panic. When you're scared, a politician can do with you what he wants to do with you. When you're not scared, you're thinking for yourself and you're saying, hey, wait, aren't you breaking the rules yourself? So the ANC has given themselves enormous amounts of power. But again, it's not just the ANC, it's every government in the world. The ANC, though, have got an ideological vision for South Africa. And we are very naive to think that a crisis such as the coronavirus crisis or an economic crisis, whatever crisis is going to come, is going to stop dedicated ideologues from wanting to achieve their goal. It can only stop them in their tracks. It does not stop their ultimate convictions. And we can see it over and over again. So expropriation without compensation, it's coming back on the table. NHI, whatever you want to call it, all the problems we had with the ANC before, it's going to come now. Whether or not the public accepts it's another question. I suspect the public is a bit more informed right now, and I hope that there's more resistance to this type of thing. But ultimately, I mean, one book I can recommend everyone read is Stephen Kotkin's book on Joseph Stalin and on the fall of the Soviet Union. And his lesson has been throughout the years of the Soviet Union, until the very day that Gorbachev walked out of office. Gorbachev did not change his convictions as a dedicated communist. People do not change their convictions, especially old men. So do not think that the ANC has changed any of this. Listen to Ramaphosa. Again, today he was stoking up racial tensions, blaming minorities in South Africa for what's happening in the United States, for example. Completely absurd. Nobody really believes that. But these guys have got their agenda, and they want to continue with what they've got.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah,
Continue
so
your thoughts.
I'm just saying that do not be naive to think that something like this will change their views. And we've seen it. We've seen journalists, for example, even beforehand when Ramaphosa got elected, praising him
Yes.
without thinking that his 20 years or whatever years he spent as a trade unionist didn't shape and form his mindset. Take Ramaphosa he was in the 80s when he was the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers. He has not changed any convictions since then, nothing seriously. He's gotten rich in the process, like a true socialist, champagne socialist. But he's not changed his convictions. So don't think that people change their convictions.
I want to add to that because I think you're bringing up where I wanted to go with this, in terms of then bringing the conversation back to the narratives and the agendas that then hopped onto the issue of police brutality in order to stoke whatever they were looking to stoke, right? In America, let's bring it back there now. I'll come back home, but America is the melting pot right now in terms of dominating the news agenda on this. In America, you literally had a situation where an issue that everybody rightly agrees should not happen, i.e. police brutality, then got taken over by various vested interest groups. What do I mean by this? In the initial, let's say, 2 days after the George Floyd incident, it was the local community where George lived that were essentially, expressing rightly outrage and saying, guys, there's something wrong in the nature in which we're policing people. It's often unfair, it's arbitrary, and it's placing us at greater conflict with a police force who we should not be in conflict with. Because again, a Gallup poll recently, a year ago, that was done actually shows that the vast majority of Americans find the police to be a trustworthy and good institution. I think 60% of Black Americans indicated that, policing in their neighborhood, insofar as the cops that they know who police them, who are on their beat, so to speak, are trustworthy and known in the community. So we know that there isn't an issue necessarily in the perception by ordinary community members about the police, but there will rightly be a criticism by them when the police don't act in a proper manner, in an expected manner. And that's why I'm saying in the first 2 days when you saw the community say, guys, there's something wrong here, everybody accepted that, yeah, look, there is an issue here, there should be accountability. And kudos to the municipality because it suspended the cops and, in fact, I think it fired the cops and has charged them. But then you saw the agent provocateurs enter the fray with their ideology-driven positions and with them pushing a certain narrative. Who are these agent provocateurs I mentioned? The likes of your Black Lives Matter, a leftist identity politics, the so-called blackness types. I like to call them blavity blacks on this show. So I think a lot of my viewers will know exactly what I mean when I say that. Entered the fray and essentially started pushing the leftist narrative through the lens of race, i.e. that blacks are victims as a predisposition to start with, and that brutality was targeted at blacks generally, even though there's no evidence for that, and there's evidence to the contrary, but I'll get to that. Then you also saw ANTIFA, the self-styled anti-fascists, ANTIFA, who are ironically the fascists themselves, given their tactics, also enter the fray. Because now when you have social unrest, by way of protest, they've always used these spaces, if you will, to stoke violence and in mobs, in crowds, be the one to break the windows, who suddenly there's pallets of bricks lying all over the route that marches are going to take, and those bricks, of course, then used to throw them into shop fronts, etc., etc. And I must add this because they've been a vocal and unhelpful role player, is that toxic mix of the media, Hollywood generally, and leftist politicians in the guise of Democrats, who are now just driving toxic narratives into what is initially, I believe, was a rightful anti-police brutality thing. Now it's become anti-other stuff, anti-capitalism, anti-Donald Trump, anti, this and that. I want you guys to weigh in here because, and I'm going to begin with you, Hugo, because we chatted about this before the break, before the show started, where I said the role of the media in this whole debacle has been absolutely appalling. In fact, I tweeted something along the lines of this week, and I said the media bears a great responsibility to the violence and the riotous looting, and essentially what we're seeing in the streets of young people coming out and saying, screw America, blah, blah, blah. We have no place in this America. And because of that, we'll just destroy everything and destroy the institutions because we have no place in this. I've always said the American media, along with the politicians, bear a great responsibility to this. Do you want to maybe talk to that point?
Yeah. First, let's make the distinction. You've got what we used to call media, which is now mainstream media, and you've got social media. But stop calling it social media. It's corporate social media. These are companies. They go to the prejudices of their own readers. And what is sinister about the social media is that now they've got algorithms to send you the news you want to hear and therefore reinforce your own ideas. Go look at the scandal for Cambridge Analytica, who helped Donald Trump get elected. They were targeting right-leaning people on the internet, priming them, sending them little flash bites of information beforehand, and then flooding of information so to change their minds. They were doing the same thing, targeting black dissident voters in America, telling them the whole system is rigged against them. Black voters, especially black males in America, voted disproportionately less in the election for Donald Trump than for Barack Obama or even before that, okay? Because this is a clear media strategy. They give blacks the victimhood mentality. They give the right-wing people the nationalist mentality. I mean, you talked about Antifa and you talked about Black Lives Matter and all these groups. There's also a right-leaning group, we should not forget. Donald Trump, okay, I'm not a big fan of him, can get re-elected because of this in the same way that Richard Nixon got re-elected in the 1970s. Because when you have riots on the streets, when you have chaos like this, all that people want is stability. And sometimes they give the stability at all costs. There was a brilliant article written by James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, for Donald Trump this week, where he criticized Trump openly in public, where he said, do not call in the National Guards, making the distinction, calling upon the distinction of the military and the police. This is a job of the police. But the media has not been helpful for the police in this case. In some cases, Hollywood, all these guys have actually encouraged the rioting. We had a protest in Paris today for Black Lives Matter. There was in London and Amsterdam. This is purely a product of media coverage. And it is a dangerous game that they are playing. To try and think that you can stoke fires, revolutionary fires, and not get eaten up by the revolution. I mean, the lesson of the French Revolution has been that the revolution ate its own children. Robespierre at the end was hanged by the very people which he supported to power because he went for tyranny. So they must be very careful what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dumo, Hugo again raises an important point. And you know what? I can see the comments here. Guys, we're discussing the US example because it's actually quite instructive in terms of the narratives that you see out of there and the ideology that you see out of there and how our left in this country literally is a carbon copy of the ideas they get there. So if you understand there, you'll understand it here. So when I talk about blabbity blacks and social justice warrior whites, those ideas, those toxic basket of ideas, they literally import from the US. So we're going to definitely focus on the US in this conversation, but we will bring it back home every now and then to show how those ideas, toxic as they are being translated here at home. Because as I always mention to you guys who watch the show, we're in a battle of ideas, and you've got to understand your opponents if you're literally going to analyze them accurately. Dumo, let me come back to you because Hugo raises an important point here about these various vested interest groups and the agendas behind them, and how sometimes, in fact most times, they form a bit of a cabal that tries to shape public opinion, drive outrage and the outrage machine, initially on social media, and as Hugo said, the corporate social media, but the ideas spill out and into the real world, and it has very serious consequences for the quality of life of the individual and for families and communities. When you have these people who are charged on these toxic ideas, then running rampage on our streets. And as I say this, and I'll get to the question just now, a lot of what you're seeing in America right now in terms of the ideas, the ideology, and the identity politics has come here to South Africa. I mean, if any of you have been noticed, there I think are 3 schools right now where the students have basically penned open letters to their principals, basically requiring all sorts of things, and the language that is used in those letters is a dead giveaway, describing, for example, Black South Africans as being a minority, that the minorities on these campuses need to be recognized. And I'm like, hang on, that's a dead giveaway that you stole this from the US, likely, because of the language, as I said, being used. There should be social justice and blah, 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 blah. Let me not get distracted. I want to come back to you on this one. the narratives and the identity politics that is driving this. Hugo rightly described the media and its role that it plays, but I know you want to talk about the identity politics and the ideology that drives groupings like Black Lives Matter, Antifa, et cetera. These guys aren't necessarily rooted in their communities. They're actually quite elitist, lefty organizations, basically feigning being community organizations, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely so. I mean, if you look at Antifa and Black Lives Matter, I mean, these are like the type of social justice warriors that come out of like university, and they've been indoctrinated by Karl Marx, and they've taken the ideology of Marx, and they've tried to apply it to other situations, whether if it's men versus women, black versus white, and so forth. And it's usually done under the guise of critical theory. So I think that also, I mean, if you look at social media and the media, how they played the role here, I think that it's also how they even describe the incidents. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, if you see like on CNN or any other left-leaning newspaper or internet sites or whatever, I mean, in the situation of George Floyd, they always said white cop kills black person. And the reason why they do that is because they want to stoke up the anger. That's the end goal at the end of the day. I mean, they could have explained it in any other way. They could have said that, no, this is bad policing and stuff like that. But no, they had to push the race narrative, because that's what gets them clicks onto their websites. That's what gets them the ad revenue, and it gets readers and so forth. And that's the game that they like to play, in my opinion.
And again, it's been really fascinating to watch, because I think you touched on it, but I want us to actually unpack this, guys. The ideas that are driving these vested interest groups. You know, you mentioned, for instance, that they generally, their politics is rooted in the left. They have their roots in Marxism, and particularly after the failure of 20th century Marxism with its body count of 100 million plus people, they've shifted ideologically to a more cultural Marxism, what's called cultural Marxism. And the basic distinction is this, where historical Marxism saw the gap in society of the exploited and the exploiter as being one of the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the elites, if you will, the rich in society. Where Marx used the class analysis, the cultural Marxists, the current crop of lefties we have, take a different spin. They create all sorts of other categories and hierarchies that fragment that relationship between the exploited and the exploiter into things like race, class, of course, gender, etc., etc. That's why you'll have a situation where a lot of the left-leaning politics of today speaks, for example, about the oppressed and the oppressor. Again, hopping onto that traditional Marxism of the exploitation, where this time the oppressed are certain echelons of society, such as blacks, gays, lesbians, all these groupings that they tend to frame in a language of being victims. And they argue, of course, that those who are at the top of the hierarchy, white, straight males, would be the sort of echelons of society that are doing the oppressing or the exploiting. Again, substituting what was viewed as the bourgeoisie for now these identity markers. Hence, you rightly mentioned the identity politics. Hugo, chime in here, because I then look at the outcomes of this type of politics in terms of a generation of young Americans who took to the streets with a misplaced anger, you know, raging against institutions that ironically accorded them the freedoms, the rights, and the institutions. For example, there's a raging right now against the politics of America, which ironically is a system that was set up over hundreds of years. A system was set up over more than a decade to essentially help a society like America, diverse society like America, settle their disputes, right? Our political systems and the institutions we create around our politics are meant to be a peaceful way in which, people like you and me in a free society should be able to settle our disputes to a large extent. But you see a pushback against these institutions in favor of this ill-defined revolution and the revolutionary talk around this. And if anything, a substituting of those institutions for this type of politics where certain people will be seen as having a greater stake and by extension having to have a greater say than others who are seen as oppressors and oppressed. Do you want to maybe chime in on this one?
Yeah, so let's go to the origin of this. I mean, always like to say, who was the first idiot who thought of these ideas? And unfortunately, every age has got his own, social justice warriors. The original thinker, as far as I can trace back, comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which was the French philosopher who made the famous saying that man is born free, but everywhere he finds himself in chains. And the idea was that we need to keep throwing off the change as we go through society. The French Revolution had it. Karl Marx plagiarized from the French Revolution. If you look at the Communist Manifesto, it's a plagiarism of the French Revolution. Guy wasn't original in his thought. He thought he's original. Only his thinkers think he's original. You can go on every age.
Okay, I think we're back. Again, apologies for that, guys. The software literally just went goodbye on me. But we're at a point where, I think Hugo was getting into the meat and potatoes of his point. Hugo, I don't know if you want to just quickly revisit the point you're making.
Yeah. So you asked before the commies shut us down, what is the origin of this thought? And I say to you that every age has had this thought. What we are facing here is nothing new, and if we have a good knowledge of history, we will know how to confront it. So I go back to the French Revolution, was inspired by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Robespierre, who eventually got hanged by some people. Hitler was encouraged by Nietzsche, for example. Nietzsche was a very nihilistic thought thinker. You had Michel Foucault in his 70s. Up until the 70s, the French intellectuals were Stalinists. Unfortunately, a lot of this crap comes from France. And Foucault came with the idea of power structures. Everywhere in the world, you've got power structures, and we need to overthrow the power structures. Every age has got these problems. We have Black Lives Matters and social justice warriors, okay? So first of all, we should not be scared about confronting these type of thinking. The Iranian Revolution is another one, for example, where Khomeini tried to overthrow the world. So every age has got people who want to burn the world down and rebuild society in their own image. Absolutely. And this is the dangerous type of thinking. You cannot rebuild a society if you burn it down. Why? Because the means of burning it down turns the society to become barbaristic. And eventually it kills itself before it can rebuild itself. The skills to achieve a revolution is a skill to also destroy a country. That is the flaw in this thinking. You can read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, for example, where he goes down into this thing. And there's another book I can recommend on this, is Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, where he calls it the modern denial of human nature. It is people who fundamentally believe that they can change man for what he is. And if you read Peter Hitchens' Abolition of Britain, he would say the contradiction for him comes in because it is usually people who believe that they can do the work of God, which is why they try and deny these existence. So they, for example, believe that they are the God who can decide about the world throughout their visions. You see this in state planning. You see this in social justice warrior. You see it everywhere. Town planning is another one of my favorite ones. Green economies, it's green on the outside, it's red on the inside. All these type of thinking has been with us for a long time. It's nothing new. So that's the first thing. People should have courage to say, this thinking is nothing new. Okay. It is, what is worrying to me about the social media thing, though, is you can see a cult-like nature along it. I mean, what we saw with these protesters, making symbolism for their white privilege, and I don't know what nonsense ever. It reminds me of the Hitlerjugend. It reminds me of the Afrikaner Stormjars. All of these people have got a little bit of symbolism. George Carlin once said symbolism is for the simple-minded. They attach a lot of symbolism to something, and then they've got this virtual signaling, the idea of original sin. It's like we have seen a modern religion forming in front of our eyes.
Absolutely.
And we need to confront this type of thinking.
And I must bring that. Sorry, you guys, I had to interject because I must bring it out in terms of some of the images I've been sharing on social media of really disturbing stuff. I mean, I want to take the viewers back to on my channel Vlog 27, where I talk about the perpetual victim black and blackness ideology, i.e. blackity blacks, and the social justice whites, the self-flagellating whites, the ones who basically say our history means that we, as white individuals living today, need to constantly be apologetic and constantly self-flagellating. It's really sickening to see those two basically form two sides of the same toxic woke coin. Dumo, some of the videos I was sharing, as I mentioned, images of the Black Lives Matter types, sort of in various rallies and whatever the case may be, telling white people who are there, they're so-called allies. That's the term they use these days for worshippers of this work religion, telling them that they need to get on their knees and apologize to black individuals. I mean, there's videos going viral of this nonsense. The virtue signaling idiot, who's the Prime Minister of Canada, did exactly the same thing. Came out to a whole bunch of protesters that came to his door and knelt in front of them. Kneeling, of course, being the sign of capitulating to a superior authority, the one that defeats you. You had the same thing with the mayor of Minneapolis, where all of this really began. I think yesterday, actually, comes out to this group, and what these lefties are now demanding, what groups like BLM and ANTIFA are now demanding, the only demand really that they've necessarily made, in and amongst the violence, is that they must hashtag defund the police. That's their biggest demand at the moment. The idea that there must be a policing, or rather there shouldn't be policing. It should be defunded. And as I was mentioning, the mayor of Minneapolis comes out to this group of protesters. I think maybe in his mind, he thought he's going to collect like a memorandum or something. And instead, they shove a mic in his face and they ask him, Mr. Mayor, can you right now say that you will agree with our demands, that you'll defund the police, the Minneapolis police in that city? Of course, the man is like, again, bear in mind, this mayor that I'm referring to is a lefty through and through. Like, this is his cup of tea. But again, as Hugo mentioned, the tiger always eats the person who lets it out of the cage. The tiger always eventually turns on the person who's riding it. And these BLM and the Antifa groups then heckle this man once he says no, he won't defund the police. And again, maybe my describing it is terrible, but you literally have the situation of this mayor with his tail between his legs, then weaving through the crowd as they shout, shame, shame, shame. Like, guys, you can't script this kind of stuff. It really is proper clown world leftism. But I wanted to ask you the question, Dumo. We're seeing this irrational lefty type politics play out in America, but it also comes back to, and also from it, asinine ideas like defund the police, for example, and stuff like that. They're not actually solutions orientated. Like, we began our conversation by saying, firstly, define exactly what the issue is, and surely there are interventions you can put in place which are liberty leaning that can solve the problem. And we'll get to that. I will have us revisit that before we go to questions around what can be done around the issue of police brutality generally in America and also here at home, and really for you in France, Hugo, you're welcome to chime in there. But Dumo, the asinine ideas that then come from the left, are they a symbol of the fact that these are not the sort of people who actually can run a free, prosperous, and functional society that adheres to the rule of law? Like, why is it such a problem? Because I know it's going to happen. People are going to say, oh, you guys always talk about lefties. You always bash lefties. You always say trendy lefties this and blavity blacks and social justice whites. But there's a reason we say this, isn't there, Dumo?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the ideas that they are pushing for, I mean, even if you look at it from an intuitive point of view, it just doesn't make logical sense. Like, for example, if you say that we need to defund the police, and then what you're going to do with that money? It's just going to sit somewhere, And then they may say we need to use it to build black communities. But I'm like, well, they had so much time to do it. Why do it now? Why make the police suffer as a result? And I mean, this is not, the first idea. The problem is that now, because everyone is on an emotional high, it just seems that the police is this bad person that needs to be, thrown into the naughty corner. Not to say that, there aren't bad police, there aren't bad policemen out there. But the problem is just that the solution that they're putting together is it's not feasible in the long run, and we must just be careful of that. We need to take a step back and say, okay, you know what is the problem? Okay, someone got killed by a police officer in a very brutal manner. Okay, so let's assess that situation. And I'm sorry, and this is one guy I want to quote, and he's a rapper, Lil Wayne. When they asked him about this situation, he just said that we need to be very specific. We can't just put the blame on the whole police, the whole everybody. We just need to be very specific. Who's this guy that killed George Floyd? Why did he do that? What's his history? And so forth. And I think from getting the evidence, we'll be able to find a better solution as opposed to just appealing to emotions and relying on mob justice and mob culture.
Absolutely. And again, moving away from this idea that you judge people by their race or you judge people by their history, as if that is symptomatic of exactly who we are. For example, I'm chatting right now to a white South African and a quote-unquote black South African. I hate these terms, but I have to use them just for the sake of being descriptive to an extent, yeah? And we differ not because we're different hues or different, have different skin color, but we differ intellectually. And that's what really matters in these sort of situations. Guys, before the comments kill me around not talking about South Africa, gosh, guys, really, you've got to... let's bring it home for a moment before I open it up to the questions, and I want to take those questions for the remainder of the show. There's two questions I want to ask before we go to questions. Number one, when it comes to South Africa, as I mentioned before, we are importing these ideas into our society. A lot of this social justice, woke, race-based politics is literally inculcated in our institutions and in our politics here in South Africa. Whether you go to a university campus, where UCT, the University of Cape Town, is an apt example right now. But I don't have time to get into that. Where, as I mentioned before, there are these schools across the country, mostly very sort of wealthy, upper class type schools, where the kids are now feigning being victims of race at these institutions, even though they're the most privileged kids arguably in the country, given where they're attending school, number one, and where they're getting their education. And right to our politics, of course, which in itself is also leftist in its nature, an ANC in this country which is governed by a socialist doctrine of the National Democratic Revolution. And through that, they've argued that race is the lens in which they view all issues, promulgating policies like black economic empowerment, affirmative action, etc., which they judge by their intentions and not their outcomes. Because the outcomes are terrible, but the intentions as they see them, they're brilliant in their worldview. Guys, ideas matter, do they not? And Hugo, I want to throw it to you because I think you might set it out quite nicely before we move on. There is a belief in this country that ideas are not that important, that somehow it's just about getting the right people into positions of power. And I often argue that the leftist types, the BLM types and the ANC types love that rhetoric because it basically means that it always becomes a case of musical chairs, and no one actually focuses on the fact that actually it's their ideas which are trash and should be kicked out. Want to quickly comment on that?
Yeah, this is the problem with that type of thinking. Again, that thinking assumes that you can change human nature. So what they're assuming is if we get a bunch of bright guys in charge of the country, they're going to make all the important decisions for us, and then you'll have heaven on earth, whether it's through a lens of race or equality or whatever your metric is. You've got a few tick boxes, and if all the tick boxes are ticked, we are in nirvana. It's complete nonsense. The reason we have these complicated societies in the Western world, why we restrain power, because we know what happens when humans get into positions of power, especially humans who are incompetent. And this is why we divide power. Dividing power is very important to try and stop man from exercising the dark angels of his nature, I think is the brilliant quote on that. The ideas matter. I mean, history is driven by ideas. If you don't believe it, go read what the Bolsheviks said. Go read what the Iranian revolutionaries say. Go read what the post-colonial movements who destroyed many African countries said. Go read at the countries who succeeded. The ideas mattered. Singapore, Botswana, for example. Post-colonial countries who were successful because they did not burn down. They didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. They didn't burn down what they inherited from the British and from the French and all these countries before they destroyed before trying to rebuild the country. And you get this impression from all these people is that they hate the modern world. They hate the fact that you and I can have a conversation here and we can disagree. We can even be racist and have a conversation. They hate that type of discussion because it doesn't fit with their preconceived vision of society. I do, however, see that these movements eventually eat themselves. If history is any guide, they kill themselves before they have any opposition. The question is just how many casualties do they take along the way?
Yeah, and that's a serious question. Dumo, before I get to questions from the audience, ideas matter. I mean, you and you're the host of the Manpatria podcast, which I encourage everybody to check out. I'll leave information in the descriptor. But you and I are in the battle of ideas. I sort of hear Hugo's a bit more negative assessment of things around whether you can change people's perspective on things or not. But I believe you can, again, with you injecting the greatest amount of ideas into a society that is susceptible to them. For instance, in South Africa, you have these 13 million South Africans, 13 million South Africans who are eligible to vote, are registered to vote, but don't vote. And I've always asked the question, why? Why don't they vote? Is it because maybe they look at our politics broadly and the body of politicians we have and they go, meh, there's no one here that actually represents my values. There's no one here that represents, or rather that's able to win my heart and mind, if you will, with solid ideas, I speak a lot about values on the show where I say my values, for instance, are love of faith, a flag, and family, and of course, freedom. And the ideas that I stump for is obviously then building that liberty-leaning, prosperous and free society that's property-owning. But I can't have these ideas occupy in a vacuum. I've got to actually go onto the ground, advocate for them, win people over, and then maybe see that sort of change. And let me put it to you then, Dumo. Surely ideas matter. Like, what are we doing if we acknowledge that you have these lefties, Gesundheit. I don't know if that was a sneeze or a cough. If we acknowledge that there are these lefties who are pushing these toxic ideas into society and they're beginning to weed into the world of work, they're finding themselves into our media, into our politics, what are we doing sitting back and just letting this happen?
Yeah, you mentioned a very great point, and so does Hugo. But I think Hugo was referring to human nature being unchangeable with regards to human beings wanting freedom. And the left trying to create this idea that they can be these gods and decide what they want to do for people. And that idea that Hugo was mentioning is a terrible idea. And as you mentioned as well, it's also finding its way into other sectors of life, work, media, you name it, and so forth. And what do we need to do? Well, I think, we're probably going to have to do what they're doing. We're going to have to challenge these ideas. And it's a good thing that you on your platform are doing so, traveling around the country, asking people questions, challenging them. I think the best one was when you went to an EFF rally. I like that one. And you were showing the EFF supporters that they actually like capitalism. It's just that they're supporting the EFF because Malema is just a strong personality. And I think that was a good thing that you did. So I think that's what liberals, classical liberals, libertarians need to do now. They need to get these ideas out into the public. Social media seems to be effective, but at the same time, the people that do not have access to the internet, we're going to have to find other ways of reaching them as well. And we need to be innovative in that way, take advantage of the technologies and what we have available to us. But definitely so, ideas do matter. It's the ideology of the ANC is what's driving their crazy policies, despite the failures that we've seen all around the world. With similar ideologies, they're still pushing for it because they're driven by it. So it's important. I think that ideas are important, and we need to give people the right ideas and tell them why that the ANC's ideas are actually false and wrong and dangerous.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I said one more question before we open it up to the guests, and we will end the stream at 10:30, so we only have 20 minutes, so just try and be short. We began this one by saying, besides now being lost in the leftist talk, the leftist rhetoric and all that nonsense and the various vested interest groups, the central issue of police brutality is still a one that needs to be addressed. Hugo, maybe your top 3 interventions on how police brutality can be challenged, and you can use South Africa or America as your reference, or even France, to be honest. But how do you actually challenge that? Because it must be challenged.
So the thing about police brutality is, first of all, I do not like the police being militarized. I like the distinction between what is the police and what is the military.
Absolutely.
But there's something else to be said. Why is it that there is more police shootings in South Africa and America than in Europe? And that question is not being asked. It's because there's more crime. And the reason there's more crime is because both our countries have what we call cultures of honor. Cultures of honors is the cultures we said, if you look at me funny, I'm going to murder you. You know, you don't find that in France. The French don't have, you know, they're not testosterone driven when people get angered. They've got what you call a dignity culture. And there's a brilliant book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. How as soon as the sheriff gets to town, for example, you sort of tell them, no, guys, you stop fighting, control your anger. You need to instill that type of thinking into people. The idea of not being offended when somebody looks at you funny or insults you will reduce crime because you move away from honor cultures. Now, honor cultures have got advantages. They are friendlier cultures. You know, South Africa is a very friendly culture, but if you look at us funny, we sometimes get offended. And that's that type of offense that you need to get rid of. By demilitarizing the police, that's one way to do it. Okay. Another way to do it is to try and get the gangs in New York, for example, not kill each other, to find legal ways to resolve their disputes, legalize certain drugs, certain type of things that make people criminals of the state. But ultimately, the fundamental thing will be you need to have a cultural attitude towards the police and towards people around you before you can reduce the crime. You can have the best police in the world in America or South Africa. We will still commit crime if you don't change the underlying culture that produces the crime.
Dumo, how do we beat police brutality?
Sorry. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, how do we beat police brutality, especially in the light of here back home?
Oh, definitely. I mean, in the US and South Africa, what I would just suggest is that obviously there has to be more collaboration between the community and the police. Also, again, I think with Hugo's point with regards to decriminalization of drugs and so forth, this will at least assist with legal disputes and everything like that. And I think also at the same time, I think maybe just better awareness from the police, because I think that their training, in my opinion, may be a bit too hectic, because I heard that in the United States, for example, many of these police officers are shown videos of their colleagues getting killed by criminals. And then what happens is even when they approach a situation where there is no threat, they're on very high alert and they may act according to what they perceive as a threat. And then that may be an overreaction. But at the end of the day, that also comes at a cost, because at the same time, you want your police to handle criminals, but you don't want them to be too soft as well. So we need to find a balance there as well. So those are my solutions.
Absolutely.
Can I add something else
sure, Hugo.
Very important? We cannot devolve in America. We cannot make the distinction between what happened, sad as it is, and the larger US society. One important thing that happened is America fought 2 wars. Okay, Afghanistan, Iraq, and they fought lots of Libya and Syria and all these things. A lot of the men who went and fought in those wars, they came back to the US and they joined the police. They were military trained, they joined the police. And you need to face that reality first, okay, to desensitize the police, you know, to not be on a battlefield and to be doing patrols, for example. It's a big change, okay? Many people cannot do it. Some of the police have got psychological problems because of the wars they fought in. But that, you know, fighting of wars has militarized the American society. Okay, in South Africa, we saw the same thing during the apartheid regime. And only when you can address that problem and face it head on, can you actually solve the problem. It's a difficult one. I mean, you don't have magic solutions to it. Police shootings need to stop. Police killings need to stop. But I mean, I think we're a bit naive to think it's not going to happen again.
Yeah, look, I would agree with both of you chaps. And my final word on this before I go to questions, I can see the questions burning in the comment section. I think as it relates to South Africa, there needs to be a professionalizing of the police force generally. And you need to remove it as far as possible from the hands of politicians and place them into the hands of communities. Community policing generally does improve outcomes, because if people feel as though that the police and the people policing them do so with their consent, what's called the Pelion Principle, the idea that a police force can only police a society with that society's consent, then you'll have better outcomes, because people will firstly know exactly who their local police are, the people who patrol the beat, and even to the levels of the leadership, the local police leadership, the station commander. If you know who that chap is, and you've got a direct line, so to speak, with him, then you can place pressure and hold them to account far better than you can under a current system where you have to sort of bypass through politicians and a bulky bureaucracy that is found in Pretoria, and you could be in somewhere like Kakamas. Shout out to those who watch the show from Kakamas. I know you guys are watching, but I mean the point being, that's the step number one is when it comes to South Africa. Number one, professionalizing the police and devolving their accountability to communities. Number two, you definitely need a situation where communities themselves take charge also of their not only their social issues, but also how they police them. I'm a great proponent of individuals in this country being armed citizens who are able to take responsibility for their own safety and for those of their families, because you tend to find in those societies, armed societies tend to be very polite societies, because on the one hand, you don't want to have things devolve to the point where you want to use that rifle or you want to use that gun on someone. But again, this is not to say that you want to build a violent side. That's not the point here. You want to build a culture where people feel as though their safety is their responsibility, especially when you look after your families, and the police are just an additional layer, if you will, to that. And maybe my last point, social issues need to be dealt by communities. You cannot expect the police to deal with social issues like drugs and the like. Those things you tackle by basically saying, firstly, decriminalize where appropriate, and secondly, focus on these things as either the health issue or the social issue that it is. Don't police and lock people up and create a militarized society in that regard. So that would be some of my interventions around how you then begin to genuinely tackle police brutality, but you don't do it by shouting lefty slogans or quote-unquote right-wing slogans and trashing cities and looting. None of that achieves the goal of defeating police brutality. Guys, I must go to the question section as I look like we're running out of time here, and I want to respect your time too. So guys, if there are any questions, I'm just going to scroll through here and see if I pick anything up. Let's see. I'm scrolling up to see maybe if I missed any. All right, I'm not seeing any questions quite yet. Lots of comments, so let me just maybe read some of the comments. Okay, here, Dylan Thatcher with the question: How do we go about shrinking government and reclaiming our rights? Just replacing the ANC won't do that. Thanks to all three of you. Dumo, how do we go about shrinking the government and reclaiming our rights?
Well, yeah, I think the best thing to do is for communities to take initiative. So, for example, we saw it happen in Harrismith. There was, I think, the water and sanitation and the sewage was not right, and the communities actually went and did things themselves. And then, as a result, they were able to fix a lot of things. So that's the first thing. Go out and take initiative. I think that hoping for a political party to change that won't do that, because at the end of the day, the political parties all have their own agendas at hand. So go out there and take initiative. That's one way, in my opinion.
Hugo?
Sorry, just repeat the question.
Yeah, how do we essentially shrink the state and reclaim our rights?
That's difficult. I mean, I would say private initiatives is one way to do so, but also try and live in the mindset of not expecting the state to do anything for you, and try and do it yourself. It's not simple. I mean, we still depend on the state for a lot of things. Okay, roads is probably the easiest example. We cannot get away from the state entirely. Where the state exists, we need to force it to reform. But in any other aspect of life, try and detach your lifestyle from the state.
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. I mean, and I say this to people all the time. Guys, politicians are not your friends. The person who wields the power to essentially inflict, pain, violence, or lock you up is not your chommy. They're not your buddy. They are literally, they literally require like maximum vigilance from us in terms of how they exercise their power. Guys, I'm trying to find more questions on here.
I've got a question. There's one guy who asked me a question about Donald Trump.
Sure.
Okay. One guy said, Trump has done good. What do you think? I don't think Trump has done good. I think the people who are following Trump And I must say, there's a lot of right-wing people following him. I think they're naive. I think you're foolish for following that person and thinking that you're going to find stability. Okay, I think people need to really rethink what type of character the guy's got, and also a lot of the decisions he makes. I mean, he's a pathological liar, Donald Trump, and I think he has exploited very well the American scene to get into power, and it's dangerous what has happened over there. I've got a book here for people which they need to read. The book is by John Mearsheimer, professor in international politics, called "The Truth About Lying in International Politics," and he makes the point about politics is that democratic governments have a bigger probability of lying to, statistically speaking, of lying to their citizens than an autocratic government. And the reason is it depends on the citizens themselves, because very often we don't care if politicians lie to us as long as the lie ended up being a bluff. So if somebody lies us into a good situation and we win from that, well, we say it was a risk, but the risk was worth it. We only hate it when the lie turns out to be a catastrophe. But yeah, again, for Donald Trump, I think people who follow Donald Trump and think he's a good president, they're foolish. Look at the guy's history. Look at what he's achieved.
To be honest with you,
I don't see it.
I think trusting any politician is a fool's errand, generally speaking. And I wouldn't single out Trump and I wouldn't single out Ramaphosa. I think politicians generally, I mean, I often say this on social media, hashtag politicians are trash. Because again, you've got to understand where things are most important in society. The individual is much more important than a politician. Families are much more important than politicians. Communities are much more important than politicians. Therefore, your ideal society is one where you devolve that power that we've given to politicians for whatever reason. And even if they're your favorite politicians, I do not care. I've said this before on the show. You devolve that power away from them and you place it into the hands of individuals. And really, as a classical liberal, we talk about individuals a lot, but really we're a family society. And families often are the beneficiaries of the freeing of individuals to pursue their self-interest, the freeing of individuals to be able to be the best and do the best they possibly can. Dumo, I don't know if you want to chime in, but actually you had. I want to just quickly maybe see if there's any other questions because they're flying past me now. And
there's a question for me there.
Yeah, hit me.
It says, Dumo, do you think Cyril is using this to deflect attention from the COVID-19 catastrophe?
That's a good question.
And I think he's talking about the George Floyd incident. Maybe so.
Maybe just chime in on that one.
Oh, okay. Well, I think what's happening now with Cyril is that I think the whole COVID-19 and even the whole George Floyd incident is actually used as a means to try and push for the whole NDR. They're trying to accelerate it and put it through and come through the back door. So just be careful of that. I think that's what politicians are trying to do. The narrative, well, not the narrative, but the motto is never let a good crisis go to waste. So whenever there's a crisis, just understand how politicians can use it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, Hugo, before you chime in, there is another question here. It's a bit of a jab / question. I don't think it's a jab at us per se, but it's one I want you to also consider. Dane Wenzel says, I find it amazing that some people are anti-Trump, but are silent on the communist police state lockdown back home here in South Africa. Maybe as you comment, do you want to maybe speak to that? The silence on Trump? Excuse me, the silence on the communist state in South Africa. Sorry.
You can criticize both and still maintain your sanity. I think that's what it is. I am against the South African lockdown. I was against the French lockdown by Emmanuel Macron. Same, it's the same victims, different tactics.
Yeah.
By the way, Donald Trump also supported a lockdown.
Yeah.
He was a bit ambiguous against it. He also supported. He's also kept on spewing the lie that it saved 100 million, or I don't even know how many million lives. You can criticize both left and right-wing politics and still be a sane, ordinary citizen. You don't have to choose one politician over another. I say when you vote, maybe vote for the least evil. Maybe that's a good strategy. But still, don't be naive to believe that Trump is going to take you to the promised land. And I think a lot of people have put a lot of hope in Donald Trump and allied themselves with his views, and you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, I agree.
If history is a guide, I encourage everyone, read history. Okay, history will tell you not to trust any politician.
Dumo, another question here from Wanut Wallace. Sorry if I butchered that, guys. Can e-government be the answer, perhaps, in the context of shrinking government?
E-government, as in like
an electronic
digitizing
government. Yeah. I don't understand what the full context of what he meant, but the question is, can e-government be the answer?
I mean, it sounds like an innovative idea. idea. I know that in Estonia, when it comes to voting, they used e-voting, and it turned out to be okay. But now the problem, I think, I mean, because the question is so ambiguous, I'm not sure if he's talking about digitizing the government in such a way that we run by an AI or something like that. I'm not sure. But I think there are certain processes that can be more efficient that the government can provide. And but again, because of the incentives that government has, and you know how cadres are, they need to get a piece of that pie. So I don't think that'll happen
if you want the internet to be screwed up, give it to the government to run.
Exactly. So I don't think so.
All right, guys. Maybe the last three questions because we're running out of time. Dylan Thatcher, do you think some on the right are exploiting? Sorry, the question zoomed up quickly. Do you think some on the right are exploiting the riots to avoid confronting real racism? Dumo?
Yes, I think that's obvious.
Yep.
I think it's obvious. I mean, some people are doing it. Look, there was a genuine case for systematic racism in the US police. Let's not forget that cop's motives might be racist. The court of law will ultimately determine it.
Yeah.
There are some communities in America where, there were cases of some black people being excluded and vice versa. So that is a conversation to be had, but to paint all the police with the same broad brush, I've got a big problem with that.
I agree.
So I don't like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Speak about racism, for example. This is one issue where the left and right-wing people can unite. We know that the reason why black communities in America and South Africa are so violent is because of absent fathers. I mean, it's been documented, it's been studied. But nobody asked the question, why didn't they have absent fathers? So in America, there's a case to be made for the welfare state, but there's a more insidious one. And I take you back again to the book by Peter Hitchens, where he spent time in the Soviet Union. And the thing that struck me the most about the Soviet Union was how the Soviet Union actively fought to destroy the Russian families. Russia's got lots of problems of violence for young youth as well. In South Africa, what did the apartheid regime do? They put black people in homelands. Father had to work far away. Mother, has to be domestic. What happens to the mother? What happens to the child? So this is an issue where both people can say, yes, there is a history which destroyed the family. But the root cause of the violence is the fact that there's no family. It's got nothing to do with the systems and the structures and all these things today. You need to try and tackle that problem.
No, I'd agree. And it's a conversation a lot of people avoid. I mean, I talk a lot about this, especially when I say that a lot of the values that I hold are defending those very institutions because I see them as being more critically important than the state. The idea of, faith, flag, family, and freedom. The family has absolutely been decimated. Here's a quick stat for those who are interested. Last year in this country, in South Africa, 62% of all new births that were registered, in other words, in a hospital, then sent to Home Affairs for data capturing, had no information on the father. Let me repeat that. 62% of all new births in South Africa had no information on the father. That is a massive, massive issue in terms of the breakdown of families as that first socializing institution. Dumo, I want to come to you because I think I saw a question for you, but it's I had it highlighted. Okay, I've lost it. I'm so sorry to whoever it was.
Well, I mean, somebody has said liberalism destroyed the black family in America.
Yeah.
I want to say it's not just the liberalism. There's state planning as well that played a role into it.
But do you want to just quickly, hang on. Do you want to maybe define the American version of liberalism? Because it isn't what the rest of the world calls liberals and liberalism.
Yeah, it's a social democratic, basically.
Progressives, trendy lefties, essentially.
Trendy lefties. So I think what they are referring to there is that there was a time, or it's still probably policy, where unmarried women in America can get more social benefits than actually being married for a young child. So obviously a lot of poor women, took the social benefits and never got married, and the father neglected their responsibility. It doesn't paint the entire picture, though, because if you look at the war on drugs, black men in America are disproportionately being targeted. So you have to ask the question, the right and the left are saying, both at fault, because the right was pushing the war on drugs. And what happens when you lock up a lot of black men in jail? Well, it happens that you find a lot of black men without fathers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, compound that with the so-called war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson introduced in the 60s, which did exactly what you're suggesting, is, incentivized single women to marry the government, and have an incentive to marry the government, because if there's no father in the household, then, the welfare check is a lot more generous, at times even creating disincentives to find work, or entry-level type work. But again, that's another topic for another day, guys. And I have run out of time. Maybe just one more question if I can find one. Shout out to you, Bushbomb, for the dollar support. I appreciate that, homie. And I think there's a question too with it. Why we haven't heard from the diaspora division? Why haven't we heard from the diaspora division? Brother, I don't really understand that question. Maybe if you reframe it, I'll try and pick it up again. But one more question from Dane Wenzel. Guys, before I let you go, what will a South Africa Black Lives Matter focus on? Definitely not Collins Causa, is the question/comment from Dane Wenzel. Dumo, let me begin with you on that one, because it has been a bit of an internal contradiction. For example, when I mentioned the kids at these well-to-do private schools basically calling themselves minorities in a country that's 89% black, 80% plus black, it's kind of weird to hear them appropriate the language of victimhood, isn't it?
Yeah, it is odd. I mean, this is what happens when you try to import American ideas without filtering it. And I think that's the problem. I mean, I discussed it in my podcast yesterday, and I said some of these demands were crazy. But I mean, if there is a South African Black Lives Matter, my advice would be, let's look at the laws and regulations that are affecting people negatively. And you find that because black people make up the majority, you find that they get mostly negatively affected by these policies that the government puts in, like the minimum wage, which tells young people that if your value of labor is below the minimum wage, you cannot get a job. And that affects a lot of young black people. So let's look at that if you want to have a South African Black Lives Matter.
I agree. Hugo, let me toss it to you before I let you guys go. The weird insistence.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was saying the weird insistence of appropriating the language of victimhood, especially for through the lens of quote unquote blackness, in a country where your president is black, the deputy president is black, the chief justice is black, 8 of the 9 premiers who govern provinces are black. Like I can go down the line. The weird insistence of using race as a perpetual victimhood narrative. Want to chime in on that quickly?
Yeah, there's a very important author in South Africa, which is sort of an unsung author we've lost about, who spent 18 years with Nelson Mandela in jail, called Neville Alexander. He's a colored from the Cape. And one of his writings, I remember as a student I read it, where he said the fact that South Africa have legitimized discrimination, okay, we are filling in forms still, for whatever reason, good or bad, is putting us on a sleepwalk towards what happened in Rwanda. And I still take that very seriously. Today we had a president who wasn't entirely saying white people are at fault for the George Floyd, the guy in America getting killed, murder. He didn't say it exactly. He was dog whistling towards it.
He was race baiting, essentially.
He was race baiting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was race baiting about it. This thing, I guess as a minorities, we look at it with more of a threat to say what's going to happen. We're not there yet. I don't believe, you guys would want to pick up pitchforks and kill me any moment soon because of what the president says. And I think most black people think for themselves, and they will not do so.
That's right.
But if you look at atrocities throughout all these countries in the last century, Cambodia, South Africa, Rwanda, a lot of the atrocities were never committed by the majority of the people. It's always a small hand of people who did it for the state. And, I take these threats seriously. I don't know what to make of it. Is it a call for action? I don't know. It's a race bait. It's political propagandizing. But I wish for it to stop. I don't know exactly how to do so. But yeah, I take you back to what Neville Alexander wrote, and I think it was 1994, and he was actually speaking from the perspective of a colored South African, saying the biggest mistake South Africa made in the early ages on was to legalize the same methods that apartheid used to discriminate against people. We still have those forms to fill in. You go to university, black, white, Indian, colored. It happens to be I'm in a relationship with somebody that is not white. What am I going to tell my child one day? Which form does he fill in?
Hey man, I just flat out refuse to answer that crap. But guys, I must end it here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hugo. How do the folks find you on your social media?
So I'm on Twitter now.
Yay! Finally.
But I don't know how long before I quit the circus, because it's a lot of anger stuff. And
I have been harassing Hugo, guys, to get on Twitter. Like, some of the arguments I have, I'm like, oh my goodness, if I can just have Hugo on here to shut this down, because you bring in the data and shut this shit down. Dude, what's your Twitter handle? How do we find you on Facebook?
So it's H Kruger, TJIE, and on Facebook, just follow my name and surname and add me as a friend. For those, I do filter my friends though. If your name is socialjusticewarrior.com or something, I'm not going to friend.
If your gender is in the bios, hey man, just know that he's not going to accept your friend request.
Exactly.
Dumo, brother, how do the folks find you and your show?
Okay, yeah. If they want to find the show, they can just go to www.manpatria.com. If they want to find me on Twitter, just at me at Dumo Denga.
Excellent. So, guys, I must say a quick thank you to both of you for having joined me on the show. And yeah, guys, hopefully you'll be on the show again. Absolutely. This was fantastic. And thank you for your time. And thank you for your time, for joining us on the show, on this live feed. I mean, it was the first time I was trialing this. Thankfully, the internet behaved. I usually have internet issues, those of you who know, on my show. But guys, thank you for watching. Remember, if you want to support your favorite fat boy, you can do that by becoming a Patreon subscriber. Join the Liberty Bus. Get on the mission of building a free, prosperous, and property-owning society, one which we can actually defend our faith, flag, family, and freedom in this country. Become a part of the BDL, Stand With BDL, hashtag Stand With BDL, as I always say. And you can do that by donating $1 a month on my Patreon. You can find the link to that in the descriptor of the video. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you, when will I see you guys? Next week sometime. And remember, as I always say when I end the show, never trust a commie.